Good morning. I'm glad to see so many people joining us. I hope that means you're all well and surviving these really strange times. Um, I have not done this as a full presentation remotely, so bear with me as we may experience technical problems. But just to begin with, I'm a master gardener for Washington County. I think this is my 6th or 7th year. I hold a bachelor's in botany and worked in land management for the Bureau of Land Management for 32 years, starting out as a botanist and working my way up into management. Then I went back to school and got a sustainable landscape design at George Washington University, and began working as the Jill of all trades for Dumbarton Oaks Park Conservancy in the rehabilitation and restoration preeminent early 20th century gardens in Washington, D.C., Dumbarton Oaks Estate. The park exactly was the Wild Garden. The whole estate was designed by Beatrix Farrand, our first professional female landscape architect, and somebody I celebrate every day. We're actually right now looking at a picture of the far end of the park. This was at one point a full woodland. And what I'll try and do today is talk about why it's so important to try and return this to a full woodland. But we're basically looking at a field of porcelainberry, bittersweet. There's perilla in there. There's stilt grass in there. There's just about every invasive we have in the Mid-Atlantic in this area.
Hi, this is Mid-Atlantic Veterinary Hospital. Just calling to check on tests, just make sure everything's okay. I know you guys have been through this before, but I just wanted to make sure, since we were having a little discomfort at the beginning, that we're still doing okay. I know you know to call us if anything.
I have no idea what's happening.
Our phone number is 301-797-1800. I will let you know that we do close early now.
Everyone, please mute your screen.
That may have been my answering machine, which I completely unplugged. So I don't know what it was, but as I said, technical problems. So what I will try to do today is talk about how to go about our role in restoring our natural ecosystems so that we don't end up with more scenes like this. Fortunately, you can't go to the park and see this anymore. It's gone. And just the remaining natural native trees are there, which is really sweet. Let's see if I can do this next. There. So today I want to talk about what are invasive plants, what are native plants, why our native plants are so important to us, and how to move our gardens from where we have them today to one that supports a greater native plant community. And then lastly, I'll go through a series of slides that show common invasive plants and their native alternatives. Invasive plants are plants that are exotic to our environment. Most of them come from overseas. Some can actually come from other parts of the United States where they're native, but they never were here originally. We care about this because most of our all of our native plants are pollinated by native insects. And as we lose our native plants, we lose our pollinators. And it's pretty important to begin to think about that from the aspect of every third bite of food we take is food that's been pollinated by some sort of insect, not always honeybees. And so if we lose our pollinators, what does that mean for our food supply? There are many, many papers that identify the cost of invasive plants. In 2005, there was a USDA paper that invasive species in the United States cost us $120 billion. That was 15 years ago. And you can multiply that by inflation, the change of our monetary value, and also the increase in invasive species. Think about the spotted lanternfly. Think about the brown marmorated stink bug. All of those happened since 2005. Also stiltgrass, wavy leaf basket grass. It's not just insects that cause the damage, it's any kind of alien biological species. Some data I have on the forest pathogen that causes sudden oak death is that it'll cost us $7.5 million to treat the trees or take down the trees to try and control that pathogen. So that's why we care. And then we'll go through where we can find them and what we can do about them. Here are some common invasive plants, just a few. The upper left-hand corner is bittersweet. The lower left is tree of heaven. The lower right is Chinese maiden grass that our horticultural community really, really likes because it's big and it's pretty and it has a really nice wave to it, but it's invasive. And then up in the upper right is Queen Anne's lace, and spotted knapweed is the purple. Queen Anne's lace is not causing economic harm so much as the bittersweet, the tree of heaven, the Chinese maiden grass, and the spotted knapweed are. So, oops, how do I go back? Uh-oh. There's a legal definition to invasive species. It's non-native to the ecosystem under consideration. Its introduction causes economic or environmental harm. And using that, a number of states and the federal government have listed specific species as invasive species, and there are legal consequences to keeping those species around. There are a lot of other exotic species that are also invading, but our system is so slow to list them, they aren't listed on the invasive species list. There's a invasives.org is a website that lists everything, whether it's actually a legally listed species or an emerging invasive species. My own personal motto is anything that's exotic and I am seeing it spread, like crepe myrtles now are reproducing and spreading. That's going to be an invasive species someday. It's not native here to our ecosystem. This happens to be my property that we bought out in Washington County. And we found that it had 4 acres of this Korean Evodia or BB tree. It took us, I'm a botanist, and it took me close to 2.5 years to identify it. And then courtesy of my husband, who was out killing tree of heaven, and he heard this humming noise, he figured out what this tree was, but it was not listed in any of my keys. It's an emerging invasive that actually the state of Maryland has now listed as a tier 2 species. This invasion, they're still trying to figure out where it came from. Most likely it came from planting at the Mount Alto University of Pennsylvania Arboretum, which is about 8 miles north of us. But you can see how dense this is. Stilt grass doesn't even grow under it. Unfortunately, we've removed most of it now, and stilt grass is appearing rapidly. So we have, you take one out, you got to deal with another one. Most of the invasive species have come in since the European settlement. They are, some species are definitely increasing with climate change. Even some of our native aggressive species are increasing with climate change. One particular one is poison ivy that thrives on the extra carbon dioxide. They came in both as agricultural crops. Garlic mustard, for instance, was brought over by the colonists to as their spring green, and where it's native in Denmark, it's, I don't know if it's endangered, but it's certainly very rare. And the Danes pay very high dollar for garlic mustard in the early spring because it's their spring green, their spring tonic. They came in as erosion control measures. Kudzu, crown vetch are primary examples. Reed canary grass were fast-growing exotic species that people felt would control the continuing increasing runoff and soil erosion issues. They are now, as you know, quite extensive. We bring them into our gardens as horticultural novelties and beauties. That's how BB tree is being spread. And so the more we know about this topic, the more we can do about it. They came in as hitchhikers in cargo. The zebra mussel is a great example in the Great Lakes, where it came in on in ship ballast water. And there's other stuff that came with that way. Stilt grass came in as a cargo hitchhiker. Actually, it wasn't a hitchhiker. It was the packing material for Japanese occupied Japan ceramics, I think is when it came in. It was used as packing material because it's really straw-like and made great packing material. We're not so happy with it nowadays. Here's Fish and Wildlife Service has a great invasive species training that you can go online and learn more about how the federal government is treating invasives, and they have a great thing. But this was I thought, a really good way to show how things, plants especially, have come in. But it's true, insects are going the same way. The spotted lanternfly especially is moving because of travel. It's hitchhiking on our cars and trucks and moving around our area. What do they do? Invasive plants can outcompete our native plants by numerous means. They can smother them, they can strangle them. Many of them, stiltgrass as an example, actually change the soil chemistry so that other plants can't grow. Where you used to hunt morel mushrooms, if it's now overrun with stiltgrass, you won't find the mushrooms anymore. It's changing the chemistry in a way that the fungi can't survive. That chemical shift in the soils also prevents the germination of native plants. And I'll show you a slide in a few minutes about its nutritional value for our insects, birds, and wildlife. This happens to be property next to mine that I love because it's fairly uninvaded by all those invasive plants. Whereas my property, you saw the BB tree, that's on the far ridge, but the side just over the hill from this is an invasive mess. And it's my responsibility to try and keep my neighbor's land free of the invasion that's spreading across the property line. So we're doing what we can to take things off of our property and helping our neighbors understand which ones they need to take off. But this is a good plant community. You can see the big trees. This is a hackberry here. I think this may be an oak, another hackberry. There's some ash up there. Unfortunately, we're losing that. This shrub is black haw, which is just coming into bloom. And then the ground plane, that's the really neat thing, is that our spring ephemerals love it on this property. There's toothwort there, there's Dutchman's breeches, mayapples, spring beauty, a number of things. This represents what the community should be in the woodlands of the basic areas, the valley areas of Washington County. So a native plant is a plant that evolved in the area associated with our local geology, soils, moisture, weather, insects, diseases, and other local plants and animals that was here before the major colonization. And most importantly, is still found growing in the area. And I really want to emphasize that particular one because there are a lot of nurserymen who sell native plants. They're native somewhere in the US, absolutely, but they're not native to our mid-Atlantic areas. And we shouldn't be bringing them into our garden. Some will move in naturally from the south as the plants move with climate change if they have enough, if they can. But most of them, we should focus on lists for the Mid-Atlantic, and the Maryland Biodiversity Project, which is online, has a great database, a growing database that people are adding to every day that shows plants that are found in local counties. So you can go online and see if a plant is in your county. Washington County is not very well represented on the online, partly because people like me don't report the plants they find. Shame on me. But if the plant is found in Frederick County and is found to the west of us, in Allegheny and Garrett County, not so much Garrett County, but definitely Allegheny and Frederick County, I feel like it's most likely here in this county, and I can plant that. The other thing that I want to mention about still found growing in the area is that plants, even though they're the same species, so if you take a mayapple from down south in North Carolina and a mayapple from somewhere in Maryland, and you grew them out together, they would probably flower at different times. They have tweaks in their genetics, just like each of us are a little bit different from our neighbor or our sister or brother. The plants also have differences. And this was brought home to me in a discussion from Pineland Nurseries that was talking about the provenance of a plant, the locality of a plant. They were working on post-Hurricane Sandy restoration in New Jersey. And they needed to get a cordgrass, the salt cordgrass, to replant in the marshes along the New Jersey coast. They couldn't find any seed locally. The closest seed they could find was 50 miles down the coast. And so they planted it, and they got good establishment, and they monitored it, and the populations that existed pre-Sandy and the populations they planted from the seed 50 miles down the coast bloomed at different times. that matters because the insects are timed to the plants that are growing where the insects are. So if an insect is dependent on the pollen of the cordgrass and it blooms 2 weeks earlier than it comes out, it has a problem because it's not there. This is just a shot of the ground plane of that parcel next to me. This is mayapple and toothwort and Dutchman's breeches. They're the Dutchman's breeches. The mayapple is this one. The toothwort is this plant right here. Just a sweet little piece that I'm going to go take a walk on this afternoon because it's probably in this condition, maybe a little farther on. So if you get a chance to go out to a woodland right now, I'd do it. It's quite nice. So native plants do a number of things for our insects and our wildlife and for us. They are the critical food chain base. They are what converts sunlight into carbohydrates and proteins that our animals, our birds, and our insects eat, and we eat. So it supports us from a number of different ways as food crops, as animal feed, as fibers. So it provides those ecosystem services. Another one that's really important is I mentioned, we introduced exotic plants for erosion control. Our native plants do a great job of flood control. Think of a sycamore bottom with red maple and red twig dogwoods in it. That's moderating the flow of the water. They also provide shade and coolness. They store carbon. They purify our air, and marshes clean our water for us. So another key thing. But I think for most people, where we tend to focus is the cultural value. We recreate in these areas. We use them to find peace and quiet and inspiration. And that is absolutely critical, at least to me. So I mentioned the difference in provisioning of exotic plants. This is a study from a graduate student under Doug Ptolemy at the University of Delaware. And she was looking at what the food values were for the birds. And so they were doing all these analysis on the fruit of these shrubs. And if you look, the top four, I'm used to demonstrating, oh, geez, back again. That pointing to these on the screen. So these four in red are common mid-Atlantic invasive shrubs. These 5 at the bottom are common native shrubs that are disappearing faster and faster. And especially under the fat, you can see the difference in how much they provide for our birds. It's critical for our migrating birds to eat a high fat diet when they're flying through our area. So if all they have is the exotics, they're going to have a hard time maintaining their weight and completing their migration. The one that is not on here that probably should be on here is poison ivy. And I don't recommend keeping poison ivy in my gardens or along my pathways, but poison ivy has a very high fat and protein content. I think it's the highest of any of our natives. So if you're lucky enough to own a woodland with big old poison ivy vines, try not to cut them down because they are absolutely critical to those migrating birds. Oh, I must have gone backwards. Let's see if I can do this. So just basically why it matters what plants are in your garden is if you have exotic plants that are going to seed, butterfly bush may be one that you've had because the nurseries have been really good about telling you how wonderful it is. It's a great nectar plant, brings in a lot of butterflies. Unfortunately, it's poison. The leaves are poisonous to anything that lays eggs on it, any of our native insects. And its nectar probably isn't as high as our native shrubs. But the worst thing is its seeds are spread by the birds into places like this. This actually sits in Catoctin National Park, I think, and it's full of barberry. The birds brought the barberry in. It's full of multiflora rose and bush honeysuckle, all of which came in from our gardens and all of which are taking over these. So you may not see them spread in your own garden, but that's because the birds eat them in your garden and then they fly to a perch somewhere else and defecate. And lo and behold, then we have a new colony of whatever the plant was that they ate. And they do the same thing with native plants. Native plants, we don't mind so much if they move around because they don't have the impact on the rest of the species that our exotic invasives do. I find this chart fascinating. I hope you will too. But again, it brings home what's happening outside of our residential areas. And I want to point out this information is 10 years old, and my perception is we've had a huge amount of development in the last 10 years. So these figures are really skewed. They're not up to date. But you can see in 2002, the change between 2002 and 2010 is in this column. And that column is going to be even more astounding when they update this. And it means that we're losing more and more of our native plant communities, our woodlands, primarily woodlands, because that's primarily what grows in Maryland. If we didn't do any land management, it would be primarily woodlands. But any of our native meadows, et cetera, are all being developed, and our fertile farmland especially is being developed. So we're losing more and more of our plants every day. These are the figures for Washington County. And I know that these percentages would jump tremendously just because of the development since I've been in the county. And Maryland is actively got programs to try and preserve both agricultural land and woodlands so that we don't continue to lose these native plant communities. There are other reasons. They don't want to lose the economic base either. So I wish it was all because they love native plants, but it's usually an economic reason. They're trying to preserve things. So actions.
If you have a second, we had a couple questions that came in. If you want to go ahead and take a couple now.
Sure.
Okay. So we had one question regarding, well, two questions regarding siltgrass. One question was, if you can change the soil chemistry, can you get rid of siltgrass?
You can, but it's pretty hard to do. The best way to get rid of siltgrass is actually to plant fast-growing things that are going to create shade. As you saw in that BB tree picture, there was no stiltgrass under the growing season picture. That's because there was too much shade for it, and they found that where they've excluded deer, which are primary carrier of the stiltgrass, as the ecosystem responded and the native plants grew up, the stiltgrass decreased. So
Got it. That's perfect. That was our next question, was the best way to get rid of stiltgrass. So that was great. And then the other question that we have is, do you have any suggestions for native plants that can help to stabilize a stream that has been eroded a lot because of last year's heavy rains, and not necessarily trees, but other types of native plants that can be used to help stabilize that stream?
there are a lot of shrubs and willows and red twig dogwoods. It depends. It really depends on where you are in the state. And I know I get to this a little later in the presentation on how to pick plants for your region in the state.
Excellent.
So why don't I try that a little later?
Okay, perfect. That sounds great. Someone asked elderberry possibly for stream bed erosion.
Absolutely.
Okay, great. So we'll get to more of those plants later on in the presentation. So that was all the questions for now. So I'm gonna let you go ahead and get back to it.
Okay, great. So what do we need to do to minimize invasives? They're always going to be here because there's so many landowners that they're not interested in plants. If it's green, they think it's good. That's not the case. So what we can do is be vigilant about it. Don't introduce new alien plants, especially known invasives. And in Maryland, it's really cool because the state of Maryland passed a law 3 or 4 years ago, maybe older than that, but under the Maryland Department of Agriculture, they are listing Tier 1 and Tier 2 species. Tier 1 species cannot be sold in the state of Maryland. Unfortunately, you can go across the border to Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Virginia, and buy them and bring them back to your garden. But they are listed as Tier 1 and cannot be sold by nurseries or stores in Maryland. And then Tier 2 can be sold, but they have to be labeled with a sign that says they are invasive. And you can go online and learn that list. And then if you're at Home Depot or Lowe's or a nursery center and you see those plants and they aren't identified, you can report them to MDA, Maryland Department of Agriculture, and they'll go in and they will be fined. That's one way we can keep them down. But learn how to identify invasive plants, especially newly emerging species, and teaching your neighbors what they are so that you can have a neighborhood reaction to the invasion. One of the cool things about the spotted lanternfly invasion is people are now very, very aware that Tree of Heaven is their host plant, and Tree of Heaven is now being killed. Yay. I mean, unfortunately, it's a very established species, and it is the tree that grows in Brooklyn was written about a Tree of Heaven. So it's a plant that's been in the country for a long time. You can remove and kill plants when they first appear. It's much easier to deal with an emerging invasion than an established one. And you can monitor your garden to see what exotics that you might have in your garden, like the crepe myrtle, that are all of a sudden sending up seedlings. Because that reseeding of the aliens is a clue to what can happen if the birds carry that seed into the woods or into the meadows. And I'm watching a plant right now in one of my meadows that I'm pretty sure is a cotoneaster. It came in by bird, and I will take it out as soon as I identify it. But I was so shocked to see a cotoneaster invading my meadow. I wanted to make sure that's what it was. Prevent the spread. If you do have a butterfly bush in your garden and you want to keep it, make sure that you remove the flower heads, every flower head after it flowers, so that you prevent the seed going somewhere else. Or if you have a bamboo hedge, confine the runners. But one thing I would ask you to think about is when you leave the property, what's going to happen? Is somebody going to keep up your excellent management of those plants that you love in your garden? And so you need to think about how you're going to transition ownership and what's going to happen after you. One of the key things you can do is, we are one of the biggest transportation means. We bring it in on our footwear, we bring it in on vehicles. If you have a lawn service, insist that they clean their mowers before they come to your place, because if they just mowed a property that has a lot of stilt grass in the lawn, you're going to have stilt grass in the lawn. And then the biggest thing is, don't compost the plant material. Unfortunately, put it in the landfill. Or what I'm doing is I'm putting it in black plastic bags and leaving it in the sun for 2 years to solarize before I do the composting. And then the biggest thing is to control and replant. And thinking about the stiltgrass question, one of the things we do along our pathways especially is I start weed whacking the stiltgrass down to pretty much bare ground, starting in about mid-June. And I have pretty much been able to eliminate it off our pathways over the last 2 or 3 years by that constant weed whacking. But it's hard on a big property. Participate in control efforts, especially, TNC, the Maryland Native Plant Society, oftentimes local counties. I know Montgomery County has a fantastic weed warrior program. National parks generally have a weed warrior program. You can participate in those control efforts. It's a great way to learn what species are invasive in your areas. And it's a great way to learn best control methods or removal methods, and what is the property owner doing to replace them. You can evaluate your own gardens and property, and we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. But most effective is to replant areas after control plants with native plants that meet your site conditions. And I've learned from my mentor, Larry Weiner, that plant as thickly as you can, because what you want to do with your native plants is outcompete the invasive seed bank that's in the ground. Stiltgrass seeds have a germination life of 13 years. I don't want to be weed whacking for 13 years. I'll be too old. But so plant thickly. In my garden beds, I plant so thickly that I don't have to mulch, and I generally don't have to weed. It's much easier to manage my garden that way. And then minimize soil disturbing activities. And I'm going to go back to Larry Weiner again, who's the author of Garden Revolution, produced by Timber Press. In there, he talks about, and he's been on my case for at least several years, to not pull out invasives. It's so satisfying to pull out a garlic mustard, but all I'm doing by pulling that out is to disturb the soil. And when I disturb the soil, I actually stir up the seed bank that's in the soil. And so I just created more work for myself, because more garlic mustard is now going to germinate, or more stiltgrass or whatever. So you're better off learning to use a pair of scissors and cutting things just under the ground surface, so you're not allowing the plant to grow from the root crown, and you're not disturbing the soil. We've got a couple of gardens out at the Washington County Ag Center that we're trying that that approach in to just kind of demonstrate that it does actually help you move forward and reduce the long-term impact of those invasives. So I want to try and move now into transitioning the garden and bringing in more native plants into our gardens. I know probably on the coast, some of you are, and on the Piedmont around DC, you're probably starting to see the wonderful flowering dogwood come into bloom. It's just breaking buds right now here in Washington County. One of my absolute favorite small trees. But Maryland is divided into 6 physiographic provinces, and physiographic provinces are based on the geomorphology, the underlying rock and soils. And those underlying rock and soils influence the plant communities and the plant species that grow in those regions. So here you can see DNR's graphic, and I sit out here on this edge of Washington County. Actually, I guess I'm right in here in the Ridge and Valley section of Washington County. This is the Blue Ridge here. This is the Piedmont, and this is the coastal zone here, the inner and the outer coastal zone. And then this is the Appalachian Plateau out here. Another way to look at this, and more detailed information, is EPA's level 3 and 4 ecoregions. This is, you can find this online. And I live in this color band right here, which is 67A. And so you can go find your location on this and find this key code here. And then you can go back to the website and you can click on this description and it will give you, I don't think I included a sample. No, I didn't. It will give you a description of the underlying geology, the topography, the soil conditions, the aspects, and most importantly, it gives you information on the plants that grow in that ecoregion. So it's a great place to start finding out what plants should you be looking at, what plants are really native to your very local situation. So I want to go back and, you know, just to show you again, is you go look up this, find your code, and then this tells you what it is here. It's part of the Piedmont uplands, but then go to this document, download it, and look up that code, and you have a wealth of information at your hands. One of the things I wanted to sort of just cover briefly is that every plant community we have has a layering situation, a layering system to it. In our woodlands, we have our canopy level, our upper trees, we have our mid-story trees, our dogwoods would be in here, our shrub layer, our spice bush would be in here, and then our ground layer, which would be our spring ephemerals or whatever native plants are growing. In a meadow, this would be your grass, your tall grass that blooms in August. This would be mid-story flowers and mid-story grasses in here. And then in this layer, you'd have some smaller herbaceous plants. And then down here, you'd have sedges and creeping things like wild strawberries and things that are hugging the ground. So every time you think about a garden, think about how you're going to establish these layers in your garden. And if you're doing a sunny garden and you have tall perennials like Joe Pyeweed, you can actually put shade-loving perennials down here under the Joe Pye, and they'll do fine because as the season goes, these layers will come in and provide the shade that the shade lovers need, or the semi-shade lovers need in the hot summers. The other thing that I think is important to think about as we garden is what happens in our ecosystem over time. Many people may live in a new subdivision. So you're in full sun and you have the wonderful, wonderful ability to put in meadow gardens and full sun lovers that some of us who live in more shady areas can't. But if you let that ground, newly disturbed ground, progress with native plants, it would start with annual plants like the mullins and fumworts, and I'm blanking on a lot of them. And the native grasses would come in and start to shade out the annual plants. And then you'll have shrubs come in, and then you'll have trees come in, and then eventually you'll get into the hardwood trees in this area. You can plant a garden the same way. Say you have an open ground and you eventually want a shade garden. I would seed my ground to a native wildflower warm season grass mixture, and I'd interplant the trees in the area that I wanted to eventually have this in. Fast growing trees, so I got that shade, and fast growing shrubs in there so I could get that shade. So I think oftentimes we're not used to thinking about, okay, if I plant today, what's going to happen in 5 years? What I want it to look like? And this, I think this chart kind of helps us keep that in perspective and plan how we actually plant this area so that we get here faster. So the first thing in transitioning your garden is what do you have? How does your garden space relate to the trees and the shrubs and the structures? You know, where's your shade? Where's your hot sun? Where's all of that? What spot gets the greatest sunlight? I live in a valley, so, you know, I'm hard pressed to get 6 hours of sunlight on most of my ground. So my tomatoes go into a very specific area. What's open in the spring and shaded in the summer? That can allow you to plant semi-shade plants in there. Can you prune, or do you need to prune, or do you need to take something out to increase your light? Where's your morning light? Where's your afternoon light? So just start watching your area, your property, and watch it over the course of a full year. I mean, you can still take actions, but it helps to kind of document your conditions over the full year. Because the reason we have spring ephemerals in the woodlands is because the sun comes down during the winter, warms that ground much faster than the other ground because it's bare, it's just leaf cover. Those plants come up, they bloom, they do their thing, they set their seed, and they disappear when the leaves come out. So you can do that with your garden. What's your soil composition? You know, what's the soil moisture content? Because there is a native plant for every condition you have on your ground. If you go for a walk in the woods and you cross a stream and cross a swamp and cross the forest, you will find something growing in every location. And generally without much room, unless the shade is so deep in the forest that you don't get growth. Another key thing is what's your soil pH? This purple cliff break here is growing on pure limestone. The partridge berry is on more acid rock. In in Washington County, we have both kinds. We have the mountain portions of Washington County are acid. The valley portions are limestone basic. And it really does control a lot of particular plants. So I love partridge berry. I can't plant it on my ground because it's not going to do well. And then the most important thing, what plants are in your garden, which are invasive, which are exotics, what are non-natives, and then begin to think about how you're going to identify, pick the plants that you want to bring into your garden. I should say back on this slide, and we'll go through it a little bit. And somebody may have already asked the question is, how do you determine which invasives to take out first? And my response is whichever ones are bugging you the most, whichever ones are taking over your garden or your neighbor's garden or whatever, those are the ones to get out and control first. Right now, I'm not taking out wineberry on my property, even though it's an invasive that came in through the agricultural system. I'm not taking it out because it provides the shade that keeps the stiltgrass population down. So that's how I'm kind of identifying that.
Do you want to take a couple questions before you get into picking plants?
Sure.
Okay, awesome. So we had one question, the URL for tier 1 and 2 species. So, and I chatted the URL to MDA's invasive plant list. Is that the best thing?
Yes, thank you very much.
Perfect. Okay. Our next question
Might
was,
be the
if somebody
internet. Hold on.
finds an invasive in the woods, who do they tell?
Who do they tell? If
Mm-hmm.
they would report it to Maryland Department of Agriculture.
Okay, got it. Thank you. Okay, the next one is looking for advice for a small peri-urban garden, less than a half mile from Bethesda, half of which is raised vegetable beds. They are particularly looking for advice on a small native tree to replace their dying Cornus florida, planted in a 7-foot wide hell strip between the sidewalk and the street. And they're also looking for advice on low shade loving natives for under 2 magnolias and pawpaws.
Pawpaws are I think they're allelopathic, which means they change the chemistry of the soil. So there's not much that grows under pawpaws. Under the hell strip, I would look at a hop hornbeam, Ostraya virginiana. It's a wonderful little, small tree that's in the elm family that might do well. Again, not knowing the full conditions of sun and shade, it's really hard to give specifics. And then on the shade lovers, I would go to, it's on the list, but there's a Fish and Wildlife Service publication called Native Plants of the Chesapeake Bay Watershed or something to that extent. And it is on the reference list at the end of the PowerPoint.
I can try to look up the URL for the PDF and put it in the chat box too.
Yeah, it's on the, well, you can't get to the end of, but anyway, it is on the reference slides, and it'll either come up under Fish and Wildlife Service or National Park Service, and it is downloadable. I don't think it's available in print anymore, but it's a great resource for plants. The other great resource is Maryland Native Plants has put out a small booklet on native plant gardening in Maryland. And you can find that probably on the Maryland Native Plant Society website.
Okay, so I just sent the link to everybody for it's called Native Plants for Wildlife Habitat and Conservation Landscaping from Fish and Wildlife Service. So I've just put into the chat the link to the PDF so you can download that on your own. Okay, so the next question is, are there special tools to cut under the surface to control invasives?
I use my soil knife
I'm
and
doing 3 things at the same time. I'm like
Sorry, let me see if I can.
grading my school stuff, writing work for the class tonight.
Okay, so I just muted that person. We're good to go. Sorry, go ahead, Ann.
I use a soil knife. I use loppers. I'll use my hand pruners. And when I'm desperate, I'll take a pair of scissors out of my kitchen and go out and attack them.
Okay. All right, great.
And I should add, Stephanie, if you're dealing with a garlic mustard patch, I use my string trimmer. I am a fan of walking around using the string trimmer on areas where I don't have to be so precise that I need a hand tool.
Next question is related. It says, how are you cutting under the soil to eliminate garlic mustard? So
I use the string trimmer is my go-to right now. And I actually was walking our property today thinking, after this class, I'm gonna strap on the string trimmer. Actually, after this class, I'm going out to plant 75 native trees and shrubs, but
oh my goodness.
Then I'll strap on that string trimmer and go after the garlic mustard. And what we've found is if you string trim it right at the top where the blooms are, you can prevent the blooms from seed set, and then use the string to get it down to the ground level. Excellent.
Makes sense. And we just had a comment. Looks like Pachyra aurea is growing under pawpaws for some folks. They've also been using a push-pull hoe to cut just below soil level, and some people suggest eating the garlic mustard. All right, so that's all the questions we have for now, Ann, if you want to keep going.
Okay. And I can second eating the garlic mustard. I had a garlic mustard pesto made by a friend the other night that was absolutely superb. So go out and collect that garlic mustard and make your pesto, or you can actually, the Danes eat it as a green. They cook it like spinach, and they also eat it in salads. So enjoy your garlic mustard. There's actually a woman in New Jersey who collects exotic invasive plants, including garlic mustard, and sells them to high-end restaurants in New York City. So you can start a business for DC and source or get rid of your invasive plants that way. But picking your plants, identify, what kind of plant characteristics you want in your garden. Do you want a flowering small tree layer, a shrub layer, herbaceous layer? Do you want a meadow with grasses and native wildflowers? And then most importantly is look at your soil and topography conditions and find out which plants grow in those conditions. Visit local natural areas that have similar to your garden conditions. I'm so lucky to be able to walk over the stone wall and see what would grow on my land. That is very, very unusual. And I totally will do anything for my neighbors to keep my privileges of walking across that wall safe. But it's just a wonderful inspiration to keep us going on our own property. Look at landscaping with native plants from the Maryland Native Plant Society, which is what I just mentioned. Virginia also puts out a similar native plant book, gardening book. Visitor call native plant nurseries. We're lucky in Maryland to have a number of them, both wholesale and commercial. And Maryland Native Plant Society lists all those on their website. Many of the commercial nurseries are only accessible to landscape designers with account or architects with accounts, but many of them also go to native plant sales. And the best one, unfortunately, was canceled this year, was the LAR native plant sale, the native plant sale associated with the LAR symposium at the US Arboretum that would have happened last weekend. Oh, I'm so sad, but look, and I think the Maryland Native Plant Society website may list a lot of those sales on their site. And then learn about the insects and the wildlife that you want to draw into your gardens. Your gardens will become their haven. If they're in the area, they will find you. So maybe you haven't seen a lot of birds recently in your garden, but if you start planting the native plants or native butterflies or caterpillars, you start planting the plants that they depend on, they will come because they're getting fewer and fewer in the landscape. Also, your gardens begin to serve as the way stations, the spots that our animals and birds and insects can actually call home and get the nutrition they need. So we play, as landowners, we are the largest land use in the state of Maryland. So we can play a really, really big role. So what I want to do now is, do you have other questions, Stephanie?
Yeah, we had a couple come in. One person asked if crepe myrtle trees are crepe myrtle trees pollinators.
Again, I'm sure there has to be some sort of pollination for them to set seed. So who the primary pollinator is, our pollinators are class, and I'm not an entomologist, so hopefully if somebody's an entomologist or a big bug person, they can make a comment to you and you can share it. But basically we have generalists, pollinator species, bee species. The honeybee is a perfect example, the honeybee, by the way, is an exotic. It comes from Europe, but it can get its nectar and protein from a number of plants. Whereas a lot of our native pollinators are specific to one plant. So the spring beauty has a relationship with a specific small native bee that can only survive on spring beauty. So while crepe myrtle obviously is pollinated in order to have seed, it's being pollinated by a generalist because it's not native here, and our insects grew up with our native plants. And if they're generalists, they can pollinate the exotics, but it's not a real close relationship like the one with spring beauty.
Got it. Thank you. The next question, a couple folks are curious about this. What do you suggest for replacing an ivy-covered slope next to a road?
Again, it's going to go back to the site conditions, the soil, and the sunlight and stuff. But one of my favorite things to recommend is any aggressive native plant. And there's a difference between invasive and aggressive. Our native plants, I think the terminology is pretty much evolved, that our native plants are aggressive. They are not invasive. Our exotics are the invasives. So some of the aggressive native plants are river oats, for semi-shade and even sun sometimes, Pachyra aurea, golden ragwort. There are probably some that'll show up in this next section of the talk. But cutleaf coneflower. I planted cutleaf coneflower. I actually grew it from seed from Prairie Moon in Wisconsin before I got really, I mean, my gardening is evolving. Your gardening will evolve. I've now evolved to planting only Washington County plants, and hopefully I can find the plants that I want in seed and collect the seed and grow out the seed so that I can really demonstrate the local garden. But this was Wisconsin cutleaf coneflower, and I planted it in an area of my garden that got good sunlight. You know, it got about 6 hours, it gets about 6 hours of sunlight. Well, all the other natives that I planted in that garden are gone. It is a solid mess of cutleaf coneflower, and I'm still trying to figure out how I'm going to get rid of it. It's absolutely gorgeous when it's in bloom from the end of July into September. The pollinators love it, but it's not what I wanted in my garden. And so that's how I would look at it, is figuring out which are the aggressive ones, which are the ones that people are complaining about in their garden.
Makes sense. All right. So for those that were looking for the replacement for ivy, sounds like maybe some good alternatives are going to come up in the next part of the presentation. We have another question. How do you get rid of Tree of Heaven?
Tree of Heaven, we have tried a couple of different methods. One that works, one of the things about Tree of Heaven, it's one of those plants where if you cut it down, it will sprout a forest because it root sprouts. And we have, when we've done that, we have then gone in with a, I think about a 2% glyphosate herbicide, and sprayed the leaves of the sprouting Tree of Heaven. And that has killed it out. But it's a lot of work. We have also, and I should stop and say this, I didn't put the tools for invasive control in there. I eat organically. I do everything I can organically, except when it comes to exotic invasive plants. I do use herbicides according to the label directions and as in minute a quantity as possible to get the control I need. Because as I said, if you just cut down Tree of Heaven, you're going to have a forest of Tree of Heaven. So you have to treat it. And the other two methods are hack and squirt between June 15th and September 15th. But what we found on our property with the hack and squirt is that the hacks collect water and the tree rots at the place where you hacked them. And in a year or two, they fall over at that hack site. And if you're in a small yard or something, that's bad. You have to be in a woodland to let them fall. And so we've gone to basal bark treatment, which what we're finding with the basal bark treatment and the triclopyr herbicide is that the trees stand tall and they shed a branch at a time. They're not falling over. It's a much slower degradation. And then once they're treated, once you've killed them and you're not seeing the root sprouts, then you can take them out. The other thing you can do is you can bring in a tree company, take the tree out, and we're now playing with then doing a basal bark treatment of the cut stump immediately after the tree has been cut and getting good control, because we found that Tree of Heaven grows the best crop of oyster mushrooms for about 2 years that you could have. And we don't want to use the poison trees. So occasionally we'll take out we've saved a Tree of Heaven from herbicide, cut it down and basal bark the the stump and been able to get control that way.
Excellent. Perfect. All right, so next question. We have one participant who's got 3 old Norway maples in their backyard. Behind them, they're seeing big and old ash trees dying in neighborhood gardens and more Norway maples. What tree would you plant for 50 years from now?
I would look at the sugar maples, unfortunately, not doing well in our climate change. I think the black maple might be a little better if you want that same kind of thing. Norway maple, as a side, is great for growing shiitake mushrooms on. We're now on our 3rd season of shiitake mushrooms on Norway maples that we've taken out. You got to use these things, you know, make them work for you. But I would think about putting in a hackberry, which is an incredible pollinator tree, putting in an oak, especially if it's a sunny area. Oaks like sun when they're just getting started. But any of our hardwood trees, if you're in an urban setting, you could do that. I would also encourage people to put in the American chestnut, which you can get from some native growers.
Mm-hmm.
And you can get others from the Chestnut Foundation.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a professor at Vassar who discovered an ecological reserve that was established on the Vassar campus in the 1930s to grow everything from the county around Vassar. And it was rampantly overgrown with porcelainberry, bittersweet, you know, all the usual thugs, tree of heaven. And what she's planting up there is she's clearing out all the porcelainberry, and they're actually digging it out, trying to get all the roots out. And then they're replanting American chestnut, because American chestnut grows really, really fast. It casts a lot of shade. And even if it gets the virus in 20 years, it's going to root sprout, and it's going to keep that shade there, which is what's going to keep the vines from coming back into that ecological reserve. So that's one thing. The other tree, I'm not sure I'd recommend it for urban areas, but is the tulip poplar. Grows really fast. So you want a fast growing tree that's gonna mature. And any of our hardwoods that aren't suffering in your area are gonna do fine. I would not plant an ash.
Yeah. Okay, so we have a couple other questions, but it seems like folks want to get back to the slides, and we can do the rest of the questions at the end. That way, if people have to jump off, it's no problem. And if anyone wants to stay and get their questions answered, we could do that. So I'm going to go ahead and mute myself again, and we'll go back to the slides. But folks, you can feel free to keep putting your questions in the chat box, and we'll get to them after we finish with the rest of the presentation.
So if you like the look of the invasive plant, if you like the structure of the tree of heaven, what would you replace it with? So this next section, what I'll do is go through the layers. Most of them will show you the bad stuff and the good stuff next to each other. Some of them are just, I put all the bads on one side, all the goods on another side. There is a great book from the Brooklyn Botanical Garden called Invasive Species and Their Native Alternatives, I think it is, by Colston Burrell. There's also a book on the website through the National Park Service called Mid-Atlantic Invasives, which also has some information on this. The Colston Burrell Brooklyn Botanic Garden is on the list. The National Park Service one is not. I think the National Park Service one is also downloadable these days. So The tree of heaven smells like, people call it burnt peanut butter smell when you scratch the twig or the bark. It stinks. Let's put it that way. The walnut is a much sweeter smell. They look similar. People confuse them. A lot of people will say, well, you can't grow anything under black walnut. Well, that's not true. There are a lot of things, a lot of native plants that like black walnuts. I have a black walnut bottom in our valley, and there isn't an inch of bare ground around it. Sure, some of them are invasives, but a lot of them aren't. So don't shy away from that. A shrub that looks like tree of heaven is the staghorn sumac. It also has a much sweeter smell than the tree of heaven, also known as the stinking sumac out here. Pretty soon we'll see the princess tree, the purple plumes of flowers blooming along our roadsides. It's a highly invasive exotic from China. Our catalpa is the best replacement. It's very similar shapes, just a beautiful white flower that the honeybees especially like. So if you're a beekeeper and you want a good native pollinator plant, that's one. So is the tulip tree. The golden rain tree, which is getting more and more invasive. I would look at the devil's walking stick. And I'm really a bad neighbor in some respects, because if you've got children who are cutting through your hedge and you don't want them, plant a devil's walking stick. They won't come through. The thorns on that sucker are stiff. And it's a beautiful, beautiful plant in bloom that the pollinators all love. And it blooms probably July, late June, July, I think. You see the red Japanese maple. This is Acer japonicum. And no, this is Acer palmatum, sorry. Acer japonicum isn't as invasive, but Acer palmatum is very invasive. And I don't normally recommend cultivars of native plants because they're doing research right now. The final story's not in, but when we mess with the genetics of a plant, we change the reasons why native insects like the plant. So they may not be as good for the insects and the birds as the straight native species is. But if you're looking for that red, the forest pansy redbud is a gorgeous plant. Here's that hop hornbeam I mentioned as a small tree, as a replacement for a dying dogwood. You can also put in a cultivar of the dogwood, an Appalachian Spring, or one out of the family of Appalachian Spring. That was a flowering dogwood that was found in the Catoctin Mountains. And it survived while all its neighbors died of anthracnose. And so that's a good resistant variety to put in, or cultivar to put in. But the Chinese elm, this is a great look-alike to get rid of that. I know Montgomery County knows Bradford pear really well. Most of us do. It's blooming right now in Washington County. The serviceberry is an excellent replacement. Yes, it does get cedar rust, and so it does get some disease issues, but one of the things that we need to learn as gardeners is that sometimes, well, definitely if the leaves are eaten, that's a sign of beauty because you know you're feeding somebody. But sometimes the plants have evolved with cedar rust disease, and it won't necessarily kill them. It might not look as nice as you want it to, but I wouldn't shy away from planting serviceberry. The yellowwood comes from just south of us. It's not really native to our area, but it's a great plant to put in place of the Bradford pear. It's absolutely beautiful. Its downside, if you will, is that it blooms every other year. It might have a couple of blooms on its off year, but it's a massed bloomer, and it blooms every 2 years. Mulberries, we have a native red mulberry here. It's very hard to find, and most of them have crossbred with the Chinese mulberry, the white mulberry, and the purple mulberries. And I would think about putting in native persimmons, which is a beautiful tree. Might be another one to put in place of, there was a dying ash, and what was the other one that the question was? But anyway, native persimmon is a gorgeous tree. The shrub layer is really important. It's what the deer have wiped out, except for the invasive shrubs. They don't eat the invasives, they only eat our natives. So if you have a way to fence out your deer, there's some great natives to put in place of the bad shrubs, the invasive shrubs. Double file viburnum was my mother's favorite plant. She was a landscape architect. Therefore, of course, I love double file viburnum, but it's invasive in the mid-Atlantic. But it's a great alternative is that black haw viburnum, which has a very wide distribution in Maryland, and it grows in acid and basic soils and stuff. So it's a great plant to put in. The deer like it, but they haven't been able to control it on this property. So it's less deer susceptible than some of its other native viburnums, like the maple leaf viburnum or the arrowwood viburnum. Burning bush is a huge issue. Strawberry bush is our native euonymus. And for this bright red color in the fall, I would look at any of the shrub dogwoods, which I may not even have on here. The shrub dogwoods, like the red twigs, the silky dogwood, and there are a couple other shrub dogwoods. All have brilliant magenta fall foliage, and the native chokeberries also have brilliant red fall foliage. So the red chokeberry and the black chokeberry are great substitutes for that red burning bush. The burning bush has taken over the Potomac Highlands in southern Washington County. You go down there in the fall, and all you see is the tall trees and then this band of red. Osmanthus, or false holly, is a shrub that's pruned, but you can get variations of the American holly that will be great substitutes for that bad actor. And then all the privets are bad. Common buckthorn, multiflora rose, wineberry, common privet, bush honeysuckles, and the autumn olives are huge issues out here in Washington County, and I suspect in most of the other counties. A good one to put in, besides the viburnums, are the spice bushes and coralberry, which I don't have on this slide, but we have a native coralberry that does fine. And as I said, in this case, what don't I have on this property? We don't have the Japanese privet, and we don't have the common buckthorn. We have everything else. And I'm leaving the wineberry in order to control the stiltgrass right now. And as I get the dogwoods and the viburnums growing in the understory, maybe the wineberry will grow. I'm also encouraging the black cap raspberry, which is native, in places. So if it's growing and there's wineberry there, I'll take the wineberry out and encourage the black raspberry. Vines, we have porcelainberry, winter creeper, vinca, Japanese honeysuckle, English ivy, and mile minute, and bittersweet. Bittersweet and Japanese honeysuckle are stranglers. They'll actually kill the plant and keep the structure by strangling it. The others generally are shade and weight problems. English ivy, this is this is the leaf shape most of us know, but when it gets to this size where it's forming berries, blooming and forming berries, it has a different shaped leaf. And so a lot of people see trees like this and don't think it's English ivy. It is English ivy. And it's really, on a tree like this, it's very difficult to kill because it's into the bark, and I think it's got its roots into the tree's transportation system. So it's getting water and nutrients out of the tree too. The Chinese and Japanese wisteria are also stranglers. Our good vines are poison ivy where you can leave it and you're not going to run into it. Wild grape. Wild grape is getting a bit more aggressive. I take it out where I'm concerned about what it's overtopping. So if it's overtopping black haw, viburnum, I'll take it off the black haw viburnum, but I generally try and leave it because it's so important to the birds. Coral honeysuckle, wild yam, Virginia creeper is a wonderful, wonderful one. It can be aggressive and you will have to probably weed it out of the garden if you put it on your fence rows and stuff. And trumpet creeper is another one. Who doesn't like to see hummingbirds? They just love that stuff. I threw this slide in just because I think it's important when you're out there working on invasive species to be able to identify things. And this one is a native. This is poison ivy. So if you find a vine with black hairs on it, regardless of the size of the vine, I have some 5 or 6 inch vines of poison ivy out here. And I have some very small vines, you know, just starting out. If it has black hairs on it, I know regardless of the season that it's poison ivy. On the other hand, this is English ivy with kind of short white hairs. And it was nice of Sligo Creek to take this picture and put it on their website so that people can see the difference, because we don't, in our national parks especially, we don't want them cutting poison ivy. We do want weed warriors cutting the English ivy. Herbaceous plants. Go eat your garlic mustard. Get it before it blooms. Crown vetch, the Canada thistle. This is very aggressive. Japanese knotweed is very, very aggressive. In England, they will not give a mortgage on property that has Japanese knotweed. It's that bad. It grows up through foundations even there. So it does that here too. It's just we haven't taken that step. Perilla or beefsteak plant is also edible. The green form is used in Japan to flavor rice, but either the green or the purple forms can be used as an herb, and they are quite aggressive. So what are some of the good things that we can replace those with? All of these are fabulous for pollinators. Some are spring, some are summer, some are fall. They're not labeled that way, but you'll find them in a lot of the reference books. The mountain mints are absolutely wonderful pollinator plants for late summer, mid to late summer. Narrow leaf mountain mint is fairly well behaved. Clustered mountain mint, which looks like this hoary mountain mint, is very aggressive. And so you need to put that in a place where you know it's going to expand itself. The hoary mountain mint is from a dry, this is actually a a native growing hoary mountain mint in the mountains of Washington County. It grows in very dry conditions. And I want to try that and see if it's as aggressive as the Pycnanthemum muticum, the clustered mountain mint. False indigo is native in various places of Maryland, and it's a great, wonderful plant for a garden. This is in our Washington County Master Gardener's demo garden. And it just comes up and it looks like a giant blue lupin, which doesn't grow here very well. The milkweeds that are well behaved for the garden are the swamp milkweed, which even though it says swamp, will grow in a garden condition. The world milkweed, which I like because it's got very delicate leaves, kind of like the narrow leaf mountain mint, and the butterfly weed are all great garden plants. And then the bee balms and the bergamots are also aggressive plants. They can be aggressive plants, but the hummingbirds and the pollinators just love long-tongued pollinators, love those plants. And then of course, a Maryland native, the black-eyed Susan. The giant blue lobelia and the ironweed are great plants. They do grow in moist, this is a moist meadow just over the border in Pennsylvania. But they translate into the garden very, very well and give you a different form and stuff. And then I love the blue vervain for its very spiky flower tops here for the garden. And then for the shade, you have so many spring ephemerals and so many different plants that you can bring in to a shade garden. Many of them are spring ephemerals, but the white wood aster, and I don't think I have a picture of the blue goldenrod, will give you wonderful fall colors in your shady areas. And your ferns, of course, will do well in shade areas and give you green the whole growing season, and for Christmas fern, actually through the winter. The red columbine and the wild geranium, even the bloodroot, can be planted in spring gardens that have sun, that are going to grow up with midsummer bloomers like the monardas and stuff, and they'll do fine in those, and they'll bloom and give you that early spring carpet, and then your other flowers will come in. Your trilliums and bellwort, definitely, they really want more of a semi-shade garden. They can't take the hot afternoon sun, so put those in with your mayaples, and there's bloodroot there with the toadshade trillium, and that's Dutchman's breeches there. And violets. Violets are the host for all the fritillary butterflies, from the great spangled fritillary down to the littlest fritillaries. So if you use this as a ground cover in your garden, you will have just a plethora, a wonderful flapping wing orange and brown cacophony of butterflies. It's wonderful. And then they're easy enough to take out when you want to plant something in their place. This is the golden ragwort that I mentioned to somebody looking to replace ivy on a slope. It has a wide variety of conditions it will tolerate. It blooms like this this was probably late April, a couple of years ago in the mountains of Virginia. And the leaves stay relatively evergreen, so it gives you good coverage all year. It is aggressive. Grasses, who doesn't like big, wonderful grasses? But unfortunately, all the ornamental grasses that most of the nurseries sell are highly invasive. So I'm taking Chinese maiden grass out of my woods here because my neighbor has it. I'm taking it out of Dumbarton Oaks Park. It's not my favorite thing to take out. It's pretty hard to get rid of. Japanese fountain grass is spreading all over the place. Of course, stilt grass, our packing material, and bamboo species are all things to really try and limit in the garden. But we do have a number of grasses, native grasses and sedges that we can replace those with. This lower one has stood in my meadow catching the sunlight all winter. I'm actually just now cutting it down so that the new growth will come up. This is broom sedge. It grows in really poor conditions. And I may not have mentioned it. Native plants don't need fertilizer. They don't need any compost supplements to your native soils. They grow in these soils. They like these soils. You fertilize them, they're going to grow too big and they're going to flop over and they're going to look terrible. So another reason why I like native plant gardening. I'm lazy. I don't have to do a whole lot for these things. I just need to put them in. We have hundreds of sedges that grow both in dry woodlands and in moister areas and swamps. This sedge actually grows in a moist, it needs moisture to grow in. So if you have a wet, sunny area in your garden, you can put this in. This is Carex lurida. And these seed heads are just gorgeous, and they mature into these beautiful brown pendulous seed heads that are just gorgeous. This beaked panic grass is an early season grass, and it's topped with purple top there. This is Indian grass here. All beautiful, beautiful grasses, and there's so many more, and you can find them in a lot of the books and references I've listed. The other thing that I really want to mention is the ferns. I'm pretty sure this is probably hay-scented fern. It's out in the middle of a wet meadow, and cardinal flower comes into the garden really nicely. And the hay-scented fern is a deciduous fern, whereas the Christmas fern is an evergreen fern. And the hay-scented fern is a colonizer and gets really thick roots so that other stuff won't come up. So it's a great replacement for an area where you have a lot of invasives. New York fern is another one. Lady fern is not a runner. It's much more compact and just more sedate. And it's a great fern. And the beauty about ferns to consider is that deer don't like ferns. And if I go back to Larry Weiner's book, Garden Revolution, and the learning I've done from him, what he does is he'll plant plants that deer really like to eat next to a fern or a grass, because they don't like either ferns or grasses. They generally leave those plants alone. So if you're planting a meadow garden, think about doing that. The New York fern and the hay-scented fern both take sunlight. So not every fern has to be maintained in a woodland or in a shady area. Planting techniques, I think, are important to consider. One, I just mentioned the hay-scented fern, it spreads a lot. So you're gonna spread that plant out. If you buy it in pots or plugs, you're gonna plant it a little farther apart so it has room to run. Whereas if it's a plant that spreads slowly, like the Christmas fern, I plant it really closely so that I don't mulch between the plants, or I do minimum mulching that first year between the plants. And the plants then can provide their own mulch and their own cover to keep the soil moist during the dry season. Wild strawberry is a wonderful creeping plant. This is not the one that has yellow flowers, obviously, and tasteless fruits, which is a potentilla, and I think is called Indian strawberry. This wild strawberry grows in our meadows, and it's the forerunner of our field strawberries, and it's far more tasty than the strawberries you get out of the market. You just have to pick a lot more of them, but it's a great ground cover to put into your sunny beds and just let it run around underneath. So dig out your invasive plant and replace it with a native plant. We've had some good success out here in Washington County using lasagna beds to convert lawn areas to new native bed by just layering it up so deep that nothing can make it through that lasagna bed. Layer the plants, fill in the root zone. Butterfly weed has a long taproot. You can plant that with our native grasses, which have big fan-shaped, deep roots. I mean, our native grasses go down 10 and 12 feet probably with root clusters. And for that stream bank question, you would want to put in the Canada wild rye, because it's going to have that fan base of roots, and then you can interplant it with the great blue lobelia or the cardinal flower, because those have a thinner root. So most of us, including me, think about everything above ground, and now I'm trying to learn about below ground, because figuring out the root layer is as important as figuring out above ground layer, because it allows you to plant plants much closer together when you know that what the root type of the plant is. And so and that way you're layering and filling the root zone as well as layering the upper the above ground part. Interplant strawberries and violets between your perennials. Let them run. Plant thickly. If they recommend planting every 8 inches, I probably plant every 4 to 6 inches. I put them cheek by jowl, because if I go out into the woods or into a meadow, there's no space between plants. And that allows me to not mulch and not weed, because the plants are doing the job for me. Another change in planting native plants, I think it probably also holds true for horticultural plants, but dig a hole the size of the pot. You want to encourage that plant to go outside of the hole you dug for it. If you dig a bed and make it really nice and make it 3 times the size of the pot, the roots of that plant will get to the edge of the hole you dug, and they're going to just start twining and circling within that, basically a pot that you dug in the soil. Whereas if you just cram it into something that's same size, it will force its roots out into the soil. As I mentioned before, don't fertilize. They don't like, I mean, they'll use it for sure, but they'll bolt to the point where you go, wow, this is an ugly plant. Whereas if they're just left in the native soil, they'll be much better. Mulch lightly with leaves or compost that first year. I spread cut up leaves on my beds in the fall. And then that first year, water as needed for establishment, but basically remember, you're putting in plants that grew up with our climate. So they're used to going dormant or less active during the dry period. So if you're planting for your soils and your moisture regime, you shouldn't need to water after that first year. And then the presentation will be available online. I don't know when, Stephanie, but it will be available online. And just here's some of the references that you'll find useful. You can see on the pollinator.org guides, they have planting guides, and they have them by region. So, you know, if you're in the outer coastal zone of Maryland, you can look at this pollinator guide. If you're in the inner coastal zone, probably this one. The Piedmont is probably the central Appalachian, but they have planting guides for pretty much all the ecosystems. Our Maryland government has a lot of resources. And then Arlington, Virginia has a fantastic ecologist who maintains just incredible references on his site that Rod Simmons, if you've ever run into him, if you get a chance to go on a walk with Rod or hear a lecture by Rod, go hear him. He knows this area like the back of his hand, and has an amazing amount of information for us. But there are so many resources for us in the Mid-Atlantic. And then the book references, and there's one that I can add to this if I can figure out how, but these are some of the books I've mentioned. As I said, I'm really impressed with Larry Weiner's book from Timber Press. He goes through the whole process, the ecology, the site planning, the planting, various strategies. I think it's very easy to read, and I know it's available through our library system out here in Washington County. But there are also books like Pollinators for Native Plants by Heather Holm and the Xerces Society that give you a lot of different information on the plants, additional information than Don Leopold may have in his book, Native Plants of the Northeast. But all of these are great references. And the one I forgot to put on is Sylvan Kaufman's invasive species book that was published probably in about 2007 or 8. And Sylvan, she's looking at all the invasive species across North America. So it's not specific to our region, but she goes through the history of how the plant got here, and more importantly, how to control it. What are effective treatments for it? So it's a really good reference. And I think,
Hi, Ann. This is Jean. I have
quite
a few questions in the chat for you if you're ready.
I am ready because this is the last slide. This is chokeberry, red chokeberry, and golden ragwort in the Washington County Native Garden, demonstration garden.
All
So
right.
go for it, Jean.
All right. So we have one commenter who said, your photos showed large tree-form hackberries, and hers are a little bit of scruffier shrubs, but they have the same bark and are hosting hackberry emperors. Can she prune one to encourage a tree-form growth?
Absolutely. It may be that they got browsed in their early life, or mowed that caused them to shrub up. But yeah, she can pick a leader and prune.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. And another is how to get rid of orchard grass.
Okay. Larry Weiner really covers this in his book. He's got a chapter on meadows making, and what you do is if you want to move from cool season grass to a warm season grass meadow, you can do it by absolutely glyphosating it 2 or 3 times and then completely replanting from seed. Or what I've chosen to do with our meadow here, which is a European grass meadow moving toward natives, is you start to mow it you mow it in late winter, and then you mow it to about 4 to 6 inches, or 6 to 8 if you can get it, in mid-April, mid-May, and mid-June, and then you let it grow up. What you're trying to do is mow off the top of the seed heads that the grass will produce during those 3 months. And once you mow off the first set, it's going to send up another seed head. You mow it off, and then you mow off that last one in mid-June. And what that's going to do is encourage any warm season grass seed to actually sprout. It won't grow until it won't germinate until June or July. So you do that for about 5 years, and you will transition the area from orchard grass into warm seasons.
Okay. And I think you did touch on this a little bit already, but we had a comment that asked what grows well under black walnut.
You can actually, I would encourage you to Google that. There are lots of things that grow under black walnut: grasses, herbaceous stuff, ferns, and there's been a lot of stuff posted online. I actually checked it out last year because we received 50 pure American chestnuts, and I wanted to make sure they would grow under the black walnut, and sure enough they would. So I would, rather than answer that, I would ask somebody to Google that. Whoever's interested, Google that. You'll find the answer pretty easily.
Okay, awesome, thanks. And then another question is false holly and osmanthus. And what is a good evergreen shrub for shade?
It depends on where you are in Maryland. Out here in the Ridge and Valley, we don't have many evergreens. We have junipers, we have Virginia pines, we have shortleaf pine, but we don't have many evergreens. So it really depends on where you are in Maryland. And you know, if you're on the coastal zone, inkberry is a great evergreen shrub, but make sure you get the pure native. Don't buy a cultivar. The native ones actually in the right place will form a great hedge, which you don't need to trim. But so it depends on where you're at. If you're in the mountains, you've got your mountain laurels and your rhododendrons and things like that, where you have acid soil.
All right, and another question here, suggestions for eradicating Canada thistle.
Herbicide. I'm sorry, I hate broadcasting herbicide, but you can actually wipe the herbicide onto the Canada thistle leaves and do it that way. And when I was in land management trying to save an threatened plant in the state of Washington, that's exactly what we did. It was threatened by Canada thistle, and we did the really intensive work of hand wiping the herbicide onto the leaves of the Canada thistle, and it released that threatened plant, and it was they no longer needed to list it. The other way to do it is to keep mowing it down. So every time you see it an inch or two above ground, weed whack it down or cut it down somehow. They did a study of how deep the roots grow. I think it was a 30-foot tower, and they planted Canada thistle at the top, and then they took the box apart at the end of the growing season, and the roots were below that 30 feet. So it's got very deep roots, and it grows, I mean, can regrow a lot. So it takes time or herbicide.
Okay. And another question about eradication. We seem to have a lot of those. One more about intensive vinca invasion on a small property. I
have some vinca on this property, and I haven't been as intensive as I should, but I weed whack it every time it shows green. You can dig it out or you can weed whack it for years, but digging out might be the fastest way if it's a small property.
Okay, and then we have quite a few questions, but one more is the good butterfly weed the tuberosa?
Yes, yes,
Okay.
it is.
All right, and a couple questions about when the presentation will be available and where to access it. So just to let everybody know, it is going to be on the Home and Garden Information Center's YouTube channel. Their YouTube channel name is just UMDHGIC. And I'm going to be including links in our next state Master Gardener newsletter to access them as well. We have one that we did last week for youth gardens, and then we'll have this one available. And hopefully, you know, as we move more towards online education, we'll have more available. But I just wanted to let everybody know that real quickly. And one person asked, what is a lasagna bed?
A lasagna bed is a wonderful technique that I learned here as a master gardener. And it's basically layering greens and browns material. So you lay down a thick layer of newspaper, really thick layer of newspaper to keep the plants that are on the ground in the area you're putting the bed from being able to come through. Matter of fact, on this slide, you can see the newspaper here. This was a lasagna bed here.
Oh, okay.
So we weed whacked the area down to bare ground. Then we put down the newspaper. Then we layered leaves and compost and grass clippings, and you can use your kitchen waste. You can use chicken manure, whatever kind of manures you want in there, and you just build it up in layers. If you go online, I think, and Google lasagna gardens, you'll find a lot of YouTube videos and directions on how to build one. But you build them up to about 8 inches, and then they begin to decompose, and you can plant them. You know, if you're not using horse manure or cow manure in there that's not well rotted, you could plant after you build the bed. But in some cases, you may want it to last, you know, decompose during the season and then plant it in the fall, or plant it, you know, if you do it in the fall, plant it in the spring.
All right,
Great.
well, thank you, Ann. That was our last big question. I think we can go ahead and wrap up unless anybody has any last minute comments, but a lot of people just wanted to say thank you, Ann, for your presentation. We had a lot of commenters just thanking you for giving such a good presentation. Steph, did you want to add anything?
No, I'm all set. Just my own thank you to Anne for presenting all this really helpful and wonderful information, and for giving us a way to stay connected and for us to continue learning some new things maybe we can try in our gardens during this time of social distancing. So very much thanks to Anne, and thank you guys all for joining us. We really appreciate it. We put a lot of links in the chat box, so go ahead and grab any of those that you want before I end the meeting. And as I mentioned, this is being recorded. Jean's gonna help us get it shared with everybody. So we had 161 participants at our highest point today, which was excellent. So we will still be able to share it with more folks, though, who couldn't join us during this time today. So we look forward to doing more of these events in the future, as we're not sure how long this situation will last. But if you have suggestions or ideas for topics or speakers, you can always feel free to let us know. So thanks again for joining us today, guys, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your week. Take care, everyone.